All right. Well, I think a few people will probably still join in the next minute or two. But good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Tom Yates. For those of you who don't know me, I'm QAA's Director of Corporate Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this online event, one of a series of events we're running in this 25th anniversary year for the Quality Assurance Agency. We want these events to form an ongoing conversation around the central question: what does quality really mean in practice in a complex and rapidly changing sector? And of course, with 25 years experience in the field, we don't come to this with a blank sheet of paper. We have our own definitions and thoughts. And so to start the conversation, our Chief Exec, Vicky Stott, wrote a piece called Defining Quality, which was published by our friends at the Higher Education Policy Institute back in March. It's freely available online, so if you haven't had a chance to read it, then I'd encourage you to do so. But today's event is entitled Reassessing Assessment, and our panel of experts will discuss how the design and delivery of assessment can enhance students' experience of HE. So I'm delighted to introduce the chair of this discussion, Professor Nick Beech, who is the Vice-Chancellor of Middlesex University. He's also recently been announced as the next chair of the UK Standing Committee for Quality Assessment, and we're very fortunate that he's also one of our board members here at QAA. He will introduce the rest of the panel. So Nick, over to you. And I think you're muted.
What a good start. Many thanks, Tom, and absolutely delighted to be here and to see so many people attending for this really important area of debate. So reassessing assessment, that's what we're about. And as Tom was saying, it's about an ongoing developmental dialogue, and really hoping that this can be part of that ongoing dialogue. We have some fantastic panel members today. Professor Mariann Rand-Weaver, who is Vice-Provost for Education at Brunel, Professor Sally Brown, Professor Emerita of HE Diversity in Teaching and Learning, and now an independent consultant, Professor Clare Peddie, who is Vice Principal Education and the Proctor at the University of St Andrews, and Jonny Barnes, who is a Quality Officer at Solent University, but also on the QAA Student Strategic Advisory Committee. And in a moment or two, I'll just say a few words of introduction, and then each of the speakers will have about 5 minutes. And then at the end of that time, we'll open up for questions, for comments, and for discussion. If you're able to put your comments or questions in the chat, that would be hugely helpful for us, and then we'll try and filter those and make sure that we've got as much involvement as possible. And please feel free to put into the chat as we go along. So, reassessing assessment. There is, as you will all know, a long debate on the nature of assessment, an assessment more focused on improving or enhancing learning, or as a form of accountability and a way of awarding credit. And I was recently reading Thomas Angelo's piece on this, in which he argued that thankfully the debate is now resolved. Well, if so, that would be fantastic. I do think, however, there are some parts in which the debate is still going on and some elements in which we really need to make a push forward. So for Angelo, the debate is now resolved in the sense that assessment should be first and foremost about enhancing student learning. And that's the thing that should drive our thinking, drive our practice, and only secondarily about determining accountability for the learning produced. So while that may be settled actually for many of the researchers in this field, for the professionals in this field, if we also ask the question, is it true for some other stakeholders? This perhaps poses a question in a slightly different way. So for government, for policy, for employers, sometimes for students and for the people who support students, is the same conclusion also true? And do they experience it in the same way? Well, I think it's fair to say that there is also a broader discourse, and it's almost one that we might typify as being the good old days. And in the good old days, assessment was very clear and people either passed it or they failed it. There was a limited availability in grades. And so it was actually quite a good way of sorting out the sheep from the goats or the sheep from the wolves, depending on how you think about it. But there was this ontology of certainty around assessment. Now, one of the interesting things is, of course, as professionals and researchers in the field, the more you get to know about it, in one sense, the less certainty, or at least simple version of certainty, one has. So that's, I think, one of the real challenges for us. Secondly, certainly if you look at the level of marketization in UK higher education over the last 25 years, but around the world, there is also a push towards commodification of qualifications and therefore of assessment. And there's interesting questions of how we would know what good looks like. I think that question is itself an interesting way of phrasing something. It assumes you can see something. And secondly, who should be defining that? So for example, should employers be defining what good assessment is and whether education has really worked? Or should it perhaps be a more collaborative venture in which multiple and different stakeholders have a say in this? So I think we're posed in reassessing assessment with this really interesting conundrum. We're trying to chart a course between what professionals and experts would say. We're trying to do to take into account the public's need, as it were, for clarity and apparent transparency. But also we need to understand how we manage the experience of success and failure. It's important for us not to forget that in the old way of doing things, the experience of failure, of course, was something that then ended up with being people being stigmatized and a form of status operating in a social division form of operating. So for me, there's a quote by David Bowd, which I think it just always animates my thinking about this. And he asked the question, how do we reframe assessment as if learning were important? And I think that is central to everything that we're trying to do here. But I would perhaps add to David's question, how do we reframe assessment as if learning were important in a way that enables the best from our various stakeholders, acknowledging that our different stakeholders bring different ontologies, different epistemologies, and different levels of insight to this sort of thing. Now, that I accept is a pretty much impossible task for our four wonderful speakers to address in the next few minutes. But what I hope it does is just provide a little bit of background, a bit of a context for the sort of dialogue that we might engage with their work with. So we're going to whiz through with some pace, and Sally will speak first, followed by Mariann, followed by Jonny, followed by Clare. I will not pass comment in between. I will just simply just try and help the transitions from one to the other. So Sally, could I come to you first?
You can, and you'll be pleased to know I've set my timer going. Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on your silver anniversary QAA. I've been with you right from the beginning. I was at Northumbria 25 years ago, where I was part then, as I still am, of the assessment for learning movement, and aligned very strongly with what Tom and Angelo was saying, quoted by Nick. When I was at the University of Northumbria, then Newcastle Poly, Kay Samble and I were working very closely together with Liz McDowell, now sadly no longer with us, on promoting the whole area of assessment being central to learning. And that work has continued. In the pandemic, we had a very interesting period where lots of the ordinary rules were thrown out the window, and Kay Samble and I actually picked up on that idea, and we published throughout the pandemic in what we call the COVID collection, which is on my website, sally-brown.net, which became a huge resource, not just for the UK, but actually quite widely globally. So do have a look there and see what we were suggesting. But in that, I was talking with Kay very much about the fact that we must never, ever go back to thinking about assessment in the way we used to do. And in fact, the pandemic has given us a really major chance for a reset to change our minds about how to do things. So I'll be covering three areas: getting assessment right by using a fit for purpose approach, making assessment sustainable, and securing standards. Back in 25 years ago in Northumbria, Peter Knight and I were talking about a fit for purpose approach to assessment, which says if you want to make assessment work, you've got to have the answers to 5 key interlocking questions. Why are we assessing? We need a clear rationale that links to the learning outcomes. And you'll see a paper from me and Kay that demonstrates this quite clearly on the 7th of August 2020, Writing Better Assignments in the Post-19 Era. Thinking about task design where assessments rationale is clearly embedded in the learning outcomes, and from those learning outcomes, it gives you an idea of what the students have got to demonstrate. Next question, what is it we're assessing? Are we assessing process or product, knowledge or capability? What students know, can do, and I think importantly now, who they are. That is their professional attributes and qualities that we want to see so much in the outcomes of the work they do in the university, where assessment is fully part of learning. It isn't something separate stuck on the end, which takes me to my third question. When do we assess? Well, certainly not subito muerto, sudden death at the end. It's got to be incremental, it's got to be progressive, and I would argue like a nest of tables, the different elements within a module need to align together. How should we assess? Well, again, at least 25 years ago, I was talking about 170 plus methods of assessment, which went way beyond essays, reports, and exams, which in those days made up over 80% of assessment. And if we think of the range of assessment methods, we can see that we need to use the right assessment for the right purpose at the right time, assessing the right things. Then we come to question 5. Who should be involved in assessment? Well, 90% of assessment in higher education UK, and similarly in most areas internationally, is undertaken by tutors, practice supervisors and employers. And yet everything we've been researching for at least 25 years, including some of the people you've mentioned already, Nick, David Bowd and others, argue that if we involve students in their own and each other's assessment, they will benefit massively because they become better at making critical judgments. And it doesn't just set them up for effective study at university, it sets them up with skills and capabilities in self-evaluation, which is lifelong and life-wide. Coming to my second broad area, if we want to make assessment sustainable, it's got to be resilient. And here I come back to the pandemic. The fact of the matter was business continuity was massively challenged by the fact that we had over-reliance on unseen, time-constrained, campus-based exams. We all had to move very fast. That's why Kay and I started writing about it. And those things didn't work if you just translated them into online. If people used the same questions, which lots of universities did, which had an over-reliance on memorization and recall, but you allowed people to do them as takeaway or distant papers, it was a disaster. And I don't think anybody would argue with that. So we've got to think of different ways. That takes us back to, if it's going to be resilient, it's got to be fit for purpose. My 5 questions. Next one, it's got to be manageable. Everybody recognises that during the pandemic, staff pulled out all the stops to make things work. Staff went way beyond the call of duty. And I think students recognise that. If you have a look at what students say about the pandemic response, when they're not feeling grumpy about the fact that life wasn't the life they were sold when they were given an idea of a university education, we then see, I'll just stop my alarm, we've got to make it manageable that they are then going to be able to enjoy. So we've got to be making it not over complex, not underwieldy, not under piloted and not under briefed. And thirdly, sustainable assessment has got to be inclusive, which doesn't just mean reasonable adjustments for special and other needs. It means decolonializing historic assumptions about the ownership of knowledge. Finally, let's not pretend when we come to standards, there's a gold standard. Erica Morris, Margaret Price and others, including me, have argued that standards are created by the community. And this is why the external examiner system that works in the UK is a glory of our system. I didn't realise back in the day that not every country has it. I work now globally and I'm delighted to see that our system is recognised. My last point, and I pushed like this when I was working on a QAA working party, new assessors, if we're going to secure standards, have to be trained and briefed and supported. We can't just throw them in at the deep end. That's me, 6 minutes. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sally. And what a start. Really superb set of ideas and a lovely coherency to them. Right. OK, we're going to move straight on. And Mariann, you're up next.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the 25th anniversary celebratory series. It's a great topic to start with, assessment, I think. I've been in academia for over 30 years, and whilst assessment has always been a point for discussion, I really think it has become more mainstream in the last 10 to 15 years. And in that time, I've seen how the sector's thinking about assessment has evolved, and you will all be familiar with discussions about diversifying assessment methods, reducing over-assessment, the importance of authentic assessment, and of course, in the last couple of years, also the use of technology. Now, we've also moved from being purely focused around academic quality and standards when we are discussing assessment. And we are thinking more about student well-being and about how we can involve them in co-production and also give them some agency over their assessments. So at Brunel, we have been championing assessment innovations for over 10 years that have aimed to address some of the assessment concerns that I've already highlighted. And I will pick on two areas where we have had some input because I think they are very topical. And although there are many drivers for their introductions, I think that maintaining or ensuring that there is a pedagogical need is absolutely necessary, because if we don't, then any changes that we make to assessment will not be sustainable. So the first example I'm going to give is that some 12 years ago, we set out to address over-assessment in our bioscience programs. And this over-assessment was impacting on both staff and students. We also wanted our students to be less siloed in their approach to learning. And our solution was integrated program assessment, or IPA for short. And this approach, I'm sure many of you will be aware of. We have shared it quite widely across the sector. And so where we've ended up with it is that we've reduced assessment by 2/3, but much more importantly, we are now using assessment as opportunities for learning as well as of learning, and doing that by focusing on the application of integrated knowledge and authentic assessment, where the tasks are deemed to be valuable learning experiences in themselves. I mean, we are all trying to prepare students for what are both unknown and uncertain future. And therefore, it's really important, at least I think so, that they are able to integrate information and apply their knowledge and experiences to new situations. The second example is the Bring Your Own Device digital exams, which we started piloting back in 2016. So way before the pandemic, I was going to say was even a word. Initially, those exams were electronic versions of pen and paper exams. But by 2019, we had examples where staff were using their technology in such a way that if the technology had failed, those exams could not have happened, i.e. the technology was absolutely integral to doing the exams. And some examples of that were students being given controlled access to, for example, 100-page color copy of a company report, coding software, Excel spreadsheets, and so on. And access to these resources were absolutely essential for them to complete their tasks. Now, with COVID, we sort of had a rethink about what actually constitutes exams. It can certainly be more than 3 hours in an exam hall. And some subjects took the opportunity to create 6-hour-long exams that allowed students free access to any resources they were able to lay their hands on to address the questions. But we asked them to annotate those resources, the papers that they used, and attach them to the final report or answer that they produced. So we were starting to also get a feel for how they were approaching answering the question, not just the final answer itself. The real value, I think, if I have to sum up this about the use of technology, for me, is that it facilitates authentic assessment and allows us a definite shift from testing what students know to what they can do. And my final point is that assessment should not be an afterthought. At Brunel, we try to use the backwards program design approach, where assessments are designed, and I use that word deliberately, and design at the point at which the program learning outcomes have been agreed. So very early on in the process, because that way we can assure ourselves that what we are asking students to do in terms of assessment is the most appropriate, valid, and reliable way for them to demonstrate achievement of the program learning outcomes. The teaching contents, the sequencing and delivery are really secondary considerations, as these are activities that should be used to scaffold students so that they are successful in their assessments. And as a closing comment, I would just like to leave you with a prediction, which is that in 25 years, and I probably won't be around then, but when we sit around celebrating the 50th anniversary of QAA, we are probably still going to be talking about assessment. And I think that's a good thing. So thank you.
Thanks, Mariann, and always a great idea to end up with a forecast and then make sure that we can't be assessed on the basis of not being there. But thanks for that input, really good stuff. Jonny, let's come to you next, and then after Jonny, Clare, I'll come to you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. It's been a pleasure listening to my colleagues already. It's nice when you sit on a panel and you're taking notes yourself. So I will be talking about student experience of assessment, their key considerations in regard to assessment, and what I consider the right approaches to address these considerations. So like Mariann, I believe that assessment should be planned and designed at the programme level. And consider the student journey as students progress through their semesters and years of study. So within each semester, the package needs to be balanced. So there's not lots of small assessments which lead students to having a continual assessment load, a continual assessment burden that's always sort of bugging them. But also having large assessments all in the exam period is equally not achievable, and that just moves the workload to another side. There needs to be an achievable heat map for students to progress through their semester. But also, if you're going on a smaller assessment workload model, then there needs to be a suitable gap in between that students can really digest their feedback and use it moving forward, whether that in the same module or a different module, so that they can sort of really focus on those areas that they want to improve on, that they've noticed, oh, actually, that's something I need to work on. Over the course length, I also believe that assessment should be cyclical. So students should be assessed in the same way multiple times, so that they can also demonstrate improvement in types of assessments. It takes a lot for a student to get to grips with the expectation of a new assessment type. It's quite, it takes a lot of time to understand what, say, a portfolio, if it's the first time you're doing what's being asked of you, how that links into what you've done, are you being reflective? And providing another portfolio opportunity in future allows students to get a greater return on investment for that time and effort that they engage with the first time. Building on Mariann's points, we should also make our assessments authentic, focusing on application as well as memorization and emphasizing skills alongside knowledge. We see this happening really well in degree programs which are directly linked to a particular profession, but application and scenario-based assessments or collaborative assessments also work really well in non-profession oriented programs, which in turn prepare our students with transferable skills and with assessments, examples of how they've used those transferable skills, which will hopefully help our graduates progress into professional employment outside of their own discipline. So as my other panel colleagues touched on, the assessment package also needs to be sustainable for academics. And this is an area where we've seen a number of universities moving into less prescriptive assessment models. So one institution I'm familiar with had a very fixed assessment tariff. So for 15 credit module at level 5 or 6, it must be 3,500 words or equivalent. And we're seeing the move to more flexibility in this area, considering assessment in relation to notional learning hours. And this could too reduce the student over-assessment, as we only then need to consider whether the learning outcomes have been met and provide a suitable opportunity for that to happen. So hopefully that would also eliminate marking over workload or attempts to. And that approach is also, it's not really new for a lot of institutions, and it's working quite well. So I've also reflected on this program design approach, moving forward with the formal introduction of micro-credentials. So my own university, currently Solent, we teach 2 20-credit concepts of management modules in partnership with University Hospitals Southampton and our business school. And these modules can be taken separately or as part of a foundation degree. And these modules were designed to be taught as part of that foundation program or a standalone. So if you read much of the discussion that's happening at the minute on about micro-credentials on Twitter, you'll see colleagues who are looking forward at their own institutions and thinking how their existing provision will work under the lifelong loan entitlement, and considering whether their modules are suitably chunked already, or whether there needs to be a more hands-on design process with micro-credentials to adapt to that new methods of delivery. And the concept of management modules that we teach at Solent were specifically designed to work within their own separate spheres as professional development modules and as a program. But my worry is that if institutions are simply repackaging their own existing models that didn't have this dual design in mind, that it would feel like students are skipping a book if you weren't on the program. If you were just a student on a micro-credential, that you're skipping a page in that assessment journey. So I think design, when we eventually come to micro-credentials being more common, is really going to have to be designed as a micro-credential, in my opinion, to ensure the comparability of the student experience. And of course, feedback is also another key consideration, and this links to sustainability and turnaround time. But something that I'd like to touch on is alternative feedback methods. My own master's dissertation, I researched video feedback, and it was really interesting to see how, although video feedback was quite time consuming for the academics, the benefit that the students got from it was very, very positive and definitely outweighed the time. So for instance, the students' reception was that because of the audiovisual methods, it allowed them to see the marker's comments in context, which led to a lot less misinterpretation. And because they could see the tutor as well, then the engagement was there because they felt like they were actually talking to a person. So I was also asked to talk about the extent that students are concerned about the rigor of assessment. And this was quite thought-provoking for me, as during my own studies, there was little discourse about explicitly about academic rigor. But of course, it is implicitly mentioned when peers and students talk about assessment. And thinking back to those conversations I had with my peers, that students actually were clearly presented with an assessment brief, really enjoyed having high expectations placed upon them, an assessment being thorough, as long as it felt fair. And I'm going to leave that as a point, in that I think would take a bit more contemplation to delve a bit deeper into that. And of course, inclusive assessment is a whole other topic for a whole other panel to discuss. So I'll leave it there and pass back to Nick.
Thanks, Jonny. Fantastic stuff. And that real provocation around program level thinking and design being crucial in the way that if we want anything that's going to be cyclical, clearly that's the sort of thinking we need. And that might or might not articulate with some of the lifelong learning ideas that are floating around at policy level at the moment. So thanks, Jonny, for that. Clare, let me come to you next.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk as the QAA celebrates its 25 years together. So I'm asked to talk about the process of protecting and managing academic standards and reporting on outcomes. And this, as Jonny's just described, is critical to the confidence that students, employers, and regulators, dare I say it, could place in our assessment outcomes. So in this phase of assessment, we arrive at a final grade, we make a judgment about the extent to which a student has achieved assessment criteria and therefore learning outcomes. So how do we assure procedures such as marking, moderation, anonymity, fairness, academic integrity are robust at the student interface level? And how do we support institutions in the systematic evaluation and enhancement of assessment, and as a consequence ensure a continuous improvement? And this is where I want to turn to the role of the external examiner. The external examiner, typically a peer, a subject expert from a different institution or another external body. The external examiner examining system is an amazingly altruistic process, which is fundamental to the exchange of academic practices inherent to the delivery of our assessment. It's almost impossible for us to imagine what our educational process in the UK would be like without our external examiners. And yet the role that they play is underestimated and often underappreciated by those outside our sector, within our sector, and often poorly understood by our students. Every course or programme within every institution has one or more external examiners. As an example, in my own university, I asked the question and I was surprised to find that we have 154 external examiners from around 60 other institutions across the UK and internationally. So it's an extraordinary mind journey to imagine the replication of that network across all of the higher education institutions in the UK, and then to realise as a consequence the inevitable impact the external examiner system has on our assessment delivery and our assessment experience. Over the past few months, in the course of working on a project to define the principles of external examining with the QAA, I've had the really good fortune to listen to practitioners working in higher education in the UK. I've listened to students, quality staff, programme leads, and external examiners themselves to talk about how they influence and protect standards of assessment. I've heard how external examiners are integral to the awarding of grades, how they ground truth marking to scriptures, benchmark against equivalent standards in their own institution. I've heard how external examiners become critical friends to programme developers in the design of assessment. And I've heard how being an external examiner is a fundamental part of the career progression, how it enhances their own provision, their own setting of assessment, and that of their department or school through debate and sharing of good practice. I've heard how external examiners are the vector of shared good practice at discipline level and how they ensure that our teaching is informed and led by the most recent advances in the research. So I believe it's not a coincidence that the UK education has got a truly excellent reputation internationally, and that most uniquely in the world, we have an external examiner system that independently, without regulation, protects and enhances the quality of our assessment standards from within the sector. And this is where I'd really like to echo Sally Brown's view on assessment, that the responsibility of this lies within our community and by our community. So in an era of change, the external examiner process is completely invaluable. It's something we should recognise, protect and develop as an inherent part of how we share good practice and continually develop assessment, as well as maintain our standards right across the UK. So thank you, that's my thoughts.
Thanks, Claire, and a lovely revisiting to some extent of Sally's setting out of this huge and really distinctive part of UK education. And as you were speaking, I know there's debate around this area of theory, but I was, for me, it's resonant of Leigh and Wenger's original work rather than later Wenger work on communities of practice and the way that we build our understanding of the world through exercising our understanding of the world together by the legitimate peripheral participation in which you learn by being an examiner, for example, something that I'm sure many people in this room could empathize with. Now, thank you all four of you for some wonderful input there, really stimulating, some of that very far-reaching, some of it also rather exciting, and probably a bit of a departure for some people in our sector. I'm not sure for how much that would be true for people in this group. Now, we have some questions and comments coming into the sidebar, but please feel free to add to that as we go, because we would love to have your thoughts and your comments. Tom, shall we perhaps start with Tyrrell Golding? Is that a sensible place to start?
Yes, sure. We might as well take them in the order they're posted, then we won't miss any. So Tyrrell Golding asks, well, it's a reflection and a question about cyclical assessment. Does cyclical assessment promote motivation so students can identify that they're improving, or may there be a risk of doing the same old, and that becoming demotivating? Would any of the panel like to comment on that?
Sally.
Thank you. I love the idea of cyclical assessment, but my preferred metaphor, as I indicated, is a nest of tables. That is, if you've got a whole module, the last thing you want to do is to leave the work to the assessment to the very end. So wouldn't it be a good idea to do an annotated bibliography about 3 weeks in, and a draft overall shape about another 3 weeks in, and then a section of it that we could comment on the register, tone, style, etc. of it. Now, not hand them all in, because that's just going to make unreasonable amounts of work. Look at ways of dialogue through site blogs, through all kinds of approaches where stuff can be done in class. I just wanted to pick up on what Fiona Cosson has also said. Fiona Cosson from ARU, who I saw on a Twitter question, is how can we ensure that students engage with feedback? My answer to that is related to what I'm just saying here, which is we've got to make sure that we do it while the students are with us in the room or virtually. If we try and just send the work out and leave it to it, then it's totally wasted opportunity for learning. I don't think you should be able to put a cigarette paper, if anybody remembers what they are, between the learning experience and the assessment experience. The two have got to be absolutely integrated. So my nest of tables of tasks means that the students are learning for the whole time. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. And Jonny, you explicitly talked about cyclical forms of assessment. I wonder if you want to perhaps respond to that, to Tyrrell's comment.
Yeah, so my initial response to this is actually that every student will have those assessments that they really like and those assessments that they really don't. I particularly detested when I got portfolio assessments. So I guess it was just, those were never my most fun, but I did really enjoy writing an essay. And of course, it's different for every student. So I think it's something that is bound to happen anyway. And I feel sorry for those which are currently not a massive fan of an essay, given that, as Sally has shared, it's about 80% of our assessment workload. So I think it happens anyway. Although I am of course a fan of Sally's more targeted approach, I guess, and more formative methods. And I think that leads into Sally's question, Sally Hanford's question next, regarding micro-credentials, just whilst I'm talking on it. And I think that Sally's approach would work really well for micro-credentials, given that we might not have any indicator really about how our students are performing prior to coming into a micro-credential. So lots of formative assessment would be really important.
And so, Jonny, when you say Sally's approach, are you thinking Sally Brown in terms of the nested tables and so on?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. Mariann, I don't know if you wanted to say anything, because in some senses, Jonny was building on your comments when thinking about this kind of cyclical process.
Yes, I mean, I think I was thinking about our integrated program assessment, where we have got quite a bit of sort of formative activities. I wouldn't necessarily call it assessments, challenge sometimes to get students to see the value of it. But one of the things that I think perhaps we need to do better might be to help students see how it might be a particular type of assessment that in itself won't get repeated, i.e. they won't get the same again. But what is it that they are learning from doing that assessment that actually will be beneficial in the future, almost whatever type of assessment that is. So help, it's a little bit the same argument as with the skills story. You know, they learn the skills in this particular sort of within a particular module, in a particular box, as it were, and then they can't apply it elsewhere. So getting students to see what they can have and transfer what they're learning experiences doing to somewhere else, I think we can probably do more of.
Yeah, and as soon as you try and do that, the learning that then spirals into new forms of learning. Tom, I can see we've got quite a lot of exciting.
They're flooding in. Yes, it's excellent. So, it's a lively debate. Yeah, I think the next one, well, it's aimed at Jonny, but others might want to comment as well. It's what method of alternative feedback do you suggest for large-sized cohorts?
So, Jonny.
Oh, well, I would not recommend video feedback because, as I mentioned, the academics I interviewed said it was very workload heavy. It was very intensive on time. Well, during my, whilst I was an SU officer for the University of Chichester, I wrote some papers considering summative comments versus whether students liked full annotations, sort of really thorough annotations. And a lot of sort of speaking to students about this piece of work found that if they had a few points that were really focused on them as an individual, it was much easier to take forward. And I guess this also kind of links into the discussions about whether assessment should be anonymous or not, or whether you should know the individual to be able to create these more targeted points for improvement. But a few targeted points were definitely better than lots of overwhelming number of minor points. So I would suggest that.
Thanks, Jonny. Claire, were you wanting to say something about that?
Yes, I wanted to say something about it. So I agree that students really do benefit from 2 or 3 really targeted comments, but I think students also benefit from hearing about frequent mistakes or frequent positive things that students have done with it. And so it's really, really helpful with a really large class to produce a common mistakes and common excellent parts of things that people saw in pieces of work that were truly excellent as well. And then the students have the benefit of not only learning from their own assessment, but also learning from the assessment that's been made by the whole class. And then in addition to that, a few targeted comments. And my experience is that the students find that incredibly valuable. So it's just an alternative suggestion.
Yeah, and the idea of mistakes as being a source of learning rather than something that's condemnatory, being crucial in the kind of the psychological well-being around learning. So thanks, Claire. Tom, let me come back to you for a selection from the rich chocolate box that we now have on the side.
Sure. The next one seems to me in part a comment, but it's directed at Sally. Sally Brown, agreeing that we should not go back, but this is from Irene Katori. But how do we achieve this given that it requires mass program overhauls in many cases and rewriting of module specs? I think Irene's thinking of timelines.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, Irene, and I answered to everybody. You might want to have a look at the paper. We've written a bit about this. I think what happened during the pandemic, and which is still ongoing, people had to think very differently, and quality assurance mechanisms within universities lightened up. And I don't think they became lesser, I just think they became more flexible. And nowadays, when Kay and I do our workshops, I always say to people, Irene, that I want people from the quality office in our workshops, because very often people have all sorts of myths. I'm sure Clare and Mariann have seen this, where people say, oh, well, the quality lot won't let us do this. And you ask them and they say, I don't see why not. I think, I mean, I headed a quality enhancement unit myself, and I ended up with a PVC role where I also kept saying, if we find a silly rule, let's not find workarounds, let's change the silly rule. So what I think we need to do is to say, let's first of all write our assignment strategies into our original briefings to build some flexibility in using words like indicative. But secondly, let's try and make it possible, if people are finding an assessment doesn't work, let's make it possible for that to be changed without it being a 2-year process. I mean, you're cracking right. It mustn't be something that's going to stop people get on making changes where they need to be made.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a common experience that external examiners and quality assessors and people that run programs in one sort of way are basically against change and innovation, and mainly
Not true. Not true.
Not true. Absolutely. They are part of the community.
And if I can piggyback on that, the professional bodies are often looked on as being further blockages and change repressors. Actually, the quality bodies are us. We've got to infiltrate them, but we've also got to try and make a convincing case. And we saw how the professional bodies were flexible in the pandemic. Now you've got to lean on that lever and make sure they continue to be flexible.
Right, I can't resist lifting that little metaphor and pulling in the rest of the panel, because I think this is one of the crucial things. In a sense, as can we have the revolution? How much extra? What do we keep doing everything else while we're also trying to have a revolution? How can we make it manageable? Which is one of the topics that you were all addressing. Clare, can I quite unfairly perhaps pick on you to have a little wrangle with that idea of this revolutionary idea and how we help it?
Well, I really like Sally's infiltration model. I think revolutions have to come from within us. It comes back to the original discussion we had earlier about the community and how we have to lead change. And you're right, the PSRBs are full of academics like ourselves. They've gone there, and so we have to lead by example. We have to talk lots and lots about all of this, and we have to infiltrate change. So I'm a bit of a person that thinks, right, okay, just steady away, just keep plugging away at this, and we will change. And sometimes change is imperceptible, but it will happen. And I think as we develop and we share good practice all of the time and we work with each other, we can lead a change that will be sustainable and will be fully justified and will be really thought through. So yeah, infiltration is a good model, I think, for making change.
Superb. Thanks, Clare. Mariann, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking back to when we made the big change in biosciences with our assessments. And actually what helped was to have a really clear vision about what we were going to achieve, and keeping that vision throughout the 6 months or so that we were doing all the changes. I have to say, I think if you get it right, to be very clear about what you're aiming for, hoping to achieve, and almost planning it beyond the sort of, yes, we made the changes to assessment, but planning it beyond that. So what is it going to look like for individual staff? Getting them on board, then that means it survives, it's sustainable. And, we are now, that was in 2010, 2011, over 10 years later, it's in bioscience is still in place. But I think it needs to be pedagogically driven, and it's got to be meaningful. And I always get asked, what, does everybody at Brunel do use integrated program assessment? Absolutely not. But it's a mixed model. Some use it for some of their program, not everything. But it is what is meaningful for that subject area, for those students and for the staff. And I think it's easier if you can have sort of one diktat from the top, maybe easier to manage. Personally, I don't necessarily think that that is the right approach if you want to take staff and students with us. There has to be some level of flexibility. Thanks,
Mariann. And in your comments, you talked explicitly about co-production. And Jonny, that was clearly a theme in what you were talking about. And Tom, if it's all right, I'm just going to jump into the sidebar and pull something out. So Theo asks what the panel think a combination of low, medium and high stakes by involving students in the design of low and medium stakes assessments, and then thinking slightly differently. And this is one of the kind of contentious areas for all of us, and that co-production and involvement is something that we may well aspire to, could well be a source of this incremental internal change, could be enabling community-led revolution. But let me just slightly reframe Theo's questions back to us to say, to what extent might co-production, co-design help us, for example, with the consequences, the stress around different stakes of assessment, and how might that also drive this slightly more far-reaching change that we're discussing at the moment? Jonny, can I start with you on that general topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think co-production works really well working from the top down and the bottom up, in that I think the middle bit is the bit which is hardest to reach. So student production works really well with re-evaluating your regulations, sort of the full down, the policies, the bits which everything else becomes a part of. And I think a lot of us around here come from large institutions who have education departments. But if there's one thing that I learnt whilst I worked for the University of Bristol as a student fellow in their Institute for Learning and Teaching, is that there's lots of students who don't study education who really have an interest in this sort of thing as well. My other student fellows studied law, engineering, English literature, politics, and all of them also had a suitable enough knowledge to be able to really evaluate what the policies were, what they needed to do to change. So I think that it doesn't really matter if you find one student who has really interested in policy and education and assessment, then you can probably do a top-down approach. If you can't manage to find one, if you are a really small specialist institution, then of course you can do a bottom-up from students who have real hands-on experience of their thoughts and feelings of their assessments, whether they thought that they could be changed for various reasons, or whether they thought that their learning outcomes could be assessed in a different way. And I think that's really important, sort of that continual reflection. But both can, of course, work together as well. Although hopefully it's somewhat coordinated to avoid people going in different directions.
Thanks, Jonny. And Clare, when you were giving your opening talk, you were focusing particularly on external examiners and the need for that level of expert engagement. How would you say that might sit alongside, or does it sit alongside, the ideas of co-production, co-design that we've just been discussing?
Absolutely. And I think in our discussions around the role of the external examiner, we've been asking ourselves the question about how important is it for the external examiner to engage directly with students that have been on the course or the program, and understanding directly from them their experience of the assessment, what it felt like, was it well managed, was it well timed, did it fit into the program, and often the students are able to engage with an external examiner about where perhaps they wouldn't be quite so open and honest with the academics for whom they have a great lot of respect, and also don't want to perhaps offend their feelings about their course design or assessment design. So I think there's absolutely a place for co-production. I think there's a place for not just a retrospective change of the assessment, but actually an active process within the module or within the course about setting the assessment and what the assessment looks like. My only slight reservation about this is my personal experiences of this is students tend to be quite hard on themselves and can actually set themselves assessments that are almost unattainable. So it often requires the module leader or the course leader to actually be proactively playing the students down and stop them designing assessment, over assessing themselves. So yeah, so I think absolutely student involvement, and as a person who personally has assessed students through their own project design process, I think it's incredibly valuable and rewarding to do so.
And I think that process of calibration in which we as learners and assessors work out quite what the right level is always an interesting one. And I remember myself as starting out in my career being calibrated completely incorrectly, partly I think because I'd misremembered quite how fabulous I'd been myself as a student, and it turned out not to be as true as I was deeply hoping. So there is that, and I benefited hugely from a mentor that just thoughtfully enabled me to think more broadly and more self-critically as a crucial part for this. Now we're almost out of time. Tom, I think I might suggest that if there's one last question you want to draw from the sidebar, we could take that quickly. And
I'm just waving goodbye because I've got a dash now. Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sally.
All right. If we'd like, thank you, Sally. If we'd like one more question, I'll pick on Tracy Bailey's question. She asks if there's anything that can be done, perhaps by the QAA, she suggests, to influence accrediting bodies, particularly wedded to closed book examinations, that they're of limited value. And it occurs to me about closed book examinations that we've been running a campaign on academic integrity with some success, but the issue runs wide, and there's increasingly sophisticated software that can tempt students into getting artificial intelligence to do some of their thinking and some of their work for them. Presumably assessment must be designed as far as possible to guard against this. Does that risk pushing assessment back to the old days of sudden death final exams and so on?
Yes, and quill and parchment being the only means appropriate. Let me just throw that open to the panel just for a quick comment in the last minute.
I can come in on that to start off with. I mean, it's really interesting how people who design assessment have responded to the situation, and we have a full spectrum. We have people who've reverted completely back to in-hall examinations with pen and paper, and they don't want to consider anything else. And in the other direction, I have seen a massive innovation and a real change of thinking, and the pandemic has led a change of thinking about how we can assess going forward. So I think the QAA has been trying and has been talking to PSRBs. I think actually there's a little bit of what we have to do in between is to work with academics in the relevant schools that are guided by PSRBs, who sometimes like to use the guidance that PSRBs have given them as an excuse to go back to the in-hall examinations. And when you actually read the guidance that the PSRBs have given, they're not necessarily quite as strict as they've been interpreted to be so. So I think we need to, I think it's not just the PSRBs, but it's in our entire community. It's about leading for us to lead people to understand that there are different ways of assessing and are possibly more authentic and more productive and lead to a better student experience overall.
Thanks very much, Claire. I'm going to have to draw it to a close there. I know people have got things booked in the next that start in about a minute's time. Can I just say a couple of words in closing? Mariann was saying, surely this debate, surely this dialogue needs to keep going and we need this to be part of it. I was absolutely enthused by the conversation today, and I think that's at the heart of it. If we can take assessment, that subject area, which many people find stressful, which many people who've had bad experiences of that in their life, so lots of people avoid it. Actually, it ought to be a really exciting area of debate. And I think we've seen some of that excitement and enthusiasm today. And secondly, that we absolutely ought to be ambitious. We ought to be ambitious to have the best forms of assessment and assessment systems that enable the really creative shifts that we've been talking about, be that with external examiners, with the use of technology, with authenticity, with programmatic forms of learning, with nests of tables, with cigarette papers, all of the other metaphors that we've had. There's a lot to go on. And so what we will try to do is we won't try and encapsulate everything, but we will try and pick up some key bits of learning, some key bits of feedback from the conversation today, and through the QAA. What we will do is try and put those back out to all of this group and through the various media to make sure this debate is ongoing. I'm sure that we can say something both learning orientated and probably something a little bit provocative, which will invite the next stage of contribution. So can I say a big word of thanks to everybody for being here today. It is really appreciated. Always a big word of thanks to the QAA for organising and for starting this all off. And in particular, thanks to Sally, who's had to leave us, to Mariann, to Jonny, and to Clare for your fantastic contributions. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.